Now, the last thing I want to talk about the guerrillas is, again, to bring up this idea that the Union Army didn't know how to deal with this situation. It was a mess. It was very violent. It was a scary place to be during the war. And they were desperate to try to contain the situation. Eventually what happens is that the Lincoln and the Army decide that they need a department, a military department, that just focuses on the border. So they create what's called the Department of the Border, basically, and they end up putting into place this guy named Thomas Ewing, who ironically happens to be, well, his father was the godfather for Sherman, so they're connected to one another in this really weird, interesting way, considering the actions that they both take. And Ewing figures out pretty quickly that that at the root of this guerrilla insurgency are these households, are women and children that are supporting them. And Leanne Whites, who is a professor down at the University of Missouri, she has gone into Ewing's papers and found really interesting things, including maps of guerrilla households and lists of guerrilla households. And what essentially Ewing had decided, and he in fact went to St. Louis to try to talk to the military commanders there, because he really did have to answer to the folks in St. Louis. He came up with this idea that what he was going to do was he was going to essentially kick out people that he could identify as being pro-guerrilla and get rid of them. The idea was that if they were gone from the border region, from these counties along the border, the counties south of Kansas City along that open border, that it would maybe put down the guerrilla insurgency. If they didn't have anybody supporting them, if they didn't have women and children that they thought they were protecting, maybe they'd go away. And maybe it would sort of, tamp things down a little bit. It would maybe make it not such a violent place. So he had decided he was going to do this, and he issued this order number 10. And in the meanwhile, this really horrible thing happened. There were some women who were arrested for being supporters of the guerrillas, and some of them were family members of some notorious guerrillas, including Bloody Bill Anderson. But others, but a group of them were arrested because essentially, as Dr. Weitz has discovered, they had a little guerrilla shirt making factory in their parlor. The Union military went to this woman's house because they had heard that she had some stolen material from a merchant in Shawnee, Kansas. And when they got there, they found that all this material had been converted into shirts, with this very sort of distinctive guerrilla style of shirts. And so they arrested them, and they arrested this group of women. They put them in what was a makeshift jail in downtown Kansas City, in a building that ironically was owned by George Caleb Bingham, the famous Missouri artist. And he had bought this building, which had 2 stories, and then he had added a story to it and had put an artist studio on the upper story of this building, probably compromising the structural integrity of the building. Meanwhile, the women were housed on the 2nd floor, and there were soldiers in the basement, and what we think happened is that the soldiers did a little bit of remodeling and moved a wall that was probably a supporting wall, and what ends up happening is this building collapses, and a number of the women are killed. Others are gravely injured by the collapse of this building. And this incident, which was horrific by any account, but most likely an accident, and I should back up by saying it was not unusual for women to be arrested for their political activities during this time period. That's a whole nother story about people's civil liberties during this time period, especially in Missouri. But at any rate, it was used as an excuse by Contrail and the other guerrilla bands in the area for a raid on Lawrence. And they had been thinking about this for a while. They really saw Lawrence, somebody earlier had called it an abolitionist hellhole. They really saw it as a symbol of all things wrong in Kansas. And it had been the center of the Free State movement. It was certainly the center of abolitionism in the state of Kansas, and so it was a real symbol to them, and they wanted to attack it. They had not yet done it though, but when this happened, when this jail collapsed, they and they felt like they were in the right because their women, again back to this idea of honor, their women had been assaulted, that it gave them the right to do this, and so they rode in at night unopposed. The people of Lawrence had kind of let down their guard because nothing had happened. They kept thinking something would happen too, and it hadn't. And they, rode in the early morning hours and committed this horrible raid where they killed certainly 150 men and boys, but we think probably even upward of that. Just killed them and burned down the town. And so in response to that, Ewing, who had issued this order number 10, but it hadn't gone into effect yet, he decides the best thing to do. It certainly gave him cover for his decision, the raid into Lawrence, but also he decides he needs to expand it. And what he does is he issues order number 11, which essentially depopulates the counties of Jackson and Cass and Bates and part of Vernon County, and tells people that they have to, if they're loyal, they can move within a mile of of a military encampment in these garrison towns. And so again, in Jackson County, that was Independence or Westport, but otherwise they had to leave. And so basically he turned thousands of women and children and elderly people, not men, because military age white men, because most of them were gone, so mostly women and children, into refugees, with nothing to their name, and they flee the area to, well, some people are working on that, where did they go, but to parts unknown, and they don't come back for a couple of years. And meanwhile they come back, some of them never come back, some of them do come back, but they come back to 2 years of back taxes, and people end up losing their land. And it's a pretty tragic episode that I think most people don't know much about. Maybe we know a little bit about it here, but sort of nationally, people don't really know about it. So this is really sort of hard war tactics that occur in Missouri way before Sherman marches a year before Sherman marches to the sea in Atlanta, and I think is the interesting connection between those two guys.